April 2, 1944. Outside the bomb-blasted outskirts of Kassel, Germany, the air smelled of burned oil and metal. Snowmelt pooled in the craters left by Allied raids, turning the ground into thick gray mud. Smoke hung low over the skeletal remains of what had once been an aircraft assembly plant. Messerschmitt fuselages half-finished, their skin peeled back like broken armor. A group of weary Luftwaffe mechanics, their blue-gray uniforms streaked with soot, stood in silence under the guard of American MPs. Among them was Oberfeldwebel Karl Dietrich, 32 years old, once proud of his precision work on Daimler-Benz engines. His hands, still stained with grease, were trembling slightly, from exhaustion perhaps or disbelief. For months he had patched together aircraft under candlelight, scavenging bolts, reusing bearings, and filing replacement parts by hand. Germany's once vaunted war industry was collapsing, strangled by Allied bombing and shortages. Now captured, Karl and his comrades were being moved west, away from the front. The rumor passed quietly among the prisoners was that the Americans were taking them to see something. A factory, one guard had said with a grin. The Germans scoffed. Factories? After seeing what total war looked like from the air, Hamburg, Cologne, Kassel burning, what factory could possibly still stand unscarred? The train journey across France and into the heart of the United States took weeks. When the prisoners finally disembarked, it was into another world. The air was clean. The sky was wide and unscarred. No ruins, no rubble, no cratered roads. Rows of cars moved smoothly down city streets, and civilians smiled without fear of air raid sirens. The contrast alone stunned the Germans into silence, but nothing prepared them for what they saw when they reached the gates of the Willow Run, assembly plant in Michigan. A whistle pierced the air as the giant doors opened, and the sound that rolled out wasn't gunfire or chaos, but rhythm. Machines moving in harmony, conveyor belts carrying gleaming metal parts in endless streams, men and women, thousands of them, working in perfect sync beneath skylights that poured sunshine across acres of concrete and steel. Karl blinked hard, almost certain his eyes were lying. The noise was deafening. Rivet guns, pneumatic drills, engines running tests in the background. But what made his jaw tighten wasn't the noise, it was the order. Every few minutes a new bomber, a B-24 Liberator, emerged further along the line. Fuselage sections locked into place, wings attached, engines bolted on. "Es ist unmöglich," murmured one of the older mechanics beside him. "It's impossible." The American escort, a young lieutenant barely old enough to shave, smiled slightly. "You're looking at the Willow Run plant," he said over the clamor. "We finish one bomber every 63 minutes. Karl stared, unable to process the number. In Germany, assembling a single aircraft required weeks of labor and specialized craftsmen, men like him. Here, women in coveralls were installing electrical panels with factory precision. Tools hung in perfect order. Each bolt, each pipe, each hose was identical, interchangeable. He turned to one of the American supervisors, an older man in overalls with an oil rag over his shoulder.
"How do they all fit?"
Karl asked haltingly in broken English. "Each part. No adjustments?" The supervisor chuckled. "That's the point, son. They're built to fit before they ever get here." He gestured toward a massive storeroom. "We don't handcraft airplanes. We build them like cars." Karl's throat tightened. Like cars. Back home, Germany's best engineers had debated for years whether aircraft could ever be built that way. The Reich's factories were smaller, decentralized, filled with master machinists who shaped parts by hand. It was a matter of pride and precision before speed. But now, staring at an assembly line stretching as far as he could see, Karl realized that pride had become their downfall. The war he thought he understood was being fought on an entirely different scale. As they were led deeper into the factory, the Germans passed a row of completed B-24s, their wings gleaming, propellers polished, serial numbers freshly stenciled, each one a 60,000-pound promise that another squadron would take off tomorrow, and the next day, and the next while German factories struggled to rebuild after every raid. One of the prisoners whispered bitterly, "If we had this, we would have already won the war." Karl didn't answer. He just watched as a bomber rolled off the line and out toward the runway. Its engine started with a confident roar, not the sputtering cough he was used to hearing in the ruins of Kassel. The ground trembled as it accelerated into the bright American sky. A perfect machine built not by artisans but by thousands of ordinary hands. For the first time, he understood something that no speech or propaganda could explain. Germany could not win a war against this. April 5, 1944, Detroit, Michigan. The morning sun streamed through tall windows as the German prisoners were ushered along a catwalk suspended above the plant floor. Below them stretched the heart of American industrial might, an assembly line the size of a battlefield, alive with motion, precision, and purpose. It wasn't chaos. It was choreography. Karl Dietrich leaned on the railing, his eyes sweeping over the sea of movement below. Rows of riveters in denim overalls worked shoulder to shoulder with young women in red kerchiefs and safety goggles. Sparks cascaded like fireworks from welders' torches. The entire floor trembled faintly with the rhythm of machines pressing. Cutting, hammering, each beat measured, timed, efficient. Each station does one job, explained an American foreman walking alongside the group. They don't need to know the whole airplane, just their part. That's how we keep it fast, the Germans exchanged glances. In the Reich's aircraft factories, only trained craftsmen were trusted to shape or assemble flight-critical components. Here, hundreds of ordinary workers built bombers as if they were assembling bicycles. The idea was both alien and humbling. Karl watched as a woman no older than his wife at home fitted an oxygen line into a bomber's fuselage. She smiled faintly as she worked, unaware of the prisoner's gaze. She wasn't a soldier, yet she was building something far deadlier than any weapon Karl had ever touched. Another POW, Sergeant Franz Bauer, muttered, "They're not soldiers. They don't even know what they're making." The foreman overheard and shrugged. "They don't have to. They just have to make it right, and make it fast." As the group descended to the factory floor, the scale of the operation became even clearer. Each B-24 bomber was built from over 500,000 parts. Yet instead of hand-fitting each one, machines shaped and drilled with flawless precision. Boxes of components labeled Boeing, Douglas North American, weighted in stacks, proof of a nationwide network, producing interchangeable parts that fit together, no matter where they came from. Karl paused beside a partially finished fuselage and ran his hand along its cold aluminum skin. There were no hammer marks, no file scratches, none of the subtle imperfections of handcraft. Everything was uniform, perfect. He felt a chill of admiration mixed with fear. One of the American guides, a captain with a clipboard tucked under his arm, noticed Karl's expression. "We call it standardization," he said. "Means we can build thousands of these, and every one of them flies the same." Karl met his gaze. "In Germany," he replied slowly, "we build for precision. You build for multiplication." The captain grinned. "Exactly." The group moved on, stepping around stacks of propeller blades, crates of avionics, and pallets of bomber turrets wrapped in protective cloth. Every corner of the plant seemed to hum with energy and purpose. Loudspeakers blared updates, production quotas, safety reminders, patriotic messages. Every shift change was like a battlefield rotation, but this battlefield had no gunfire, only the relentless hum of machinery. As the tour continued, the prisoners were shown the massive final assembly hangar. It was nearly a quarter-mile long. At one end, skeletal airframes hung in midair, supported by massive jigs. At the other, completed B-24 Liberators gleamed under bright inspection lamps ready for flight tests. Mechanics in clean uniforms checked hydraulic lines, fuel systems, and engines. The smell of fuel and hot metal filled the air. Franz Bauer whispered under his breath, "Our factories. They build one Mi-109 every 2 weeks. Here they build an air fleet before lunch." Karl didn't respond. He was too busy staring at the far end of the line, where the factory doors opened and a completed bomber, "Witchcraft," its nose art declared, rolled into daylight. Workers cheered as it emerged, engines idling low, sunlight glinting off its polished wings. Cameras flashed. Somewhere a band was playing. The German prisoners stood motionless. It wasn't just the machine they were looking at. It was a symbol, a testament to a nation that could turn industry itself into a weapon. Back home, the Luftwaffe's own production plants were buried under rubble or scattered into secret tunnels. Skilled machinists worked in freezing conditions with dwindling supplies. Aluminum was rationed. Fuel was scarce. Every new aircraft felt like a miracle dragged from the ruins. Here, miracles rolled off conveyor belts. The American officer finally spoke, his voice calm but firm. "You fought hard," he said, addressing them all. "But war isn't just about courage or tactics. It's about who can build faster, who can replace what's lost. That's how we'll win." Carl stared at the endless line of B-24s, engines gleaming under the factory lights. For the first time, he believed him. April 5, 1944, afternoon. The tour had lasted only 2 hours, but for the German prisoners it felt like they'd seen another world. Outside the plant, the roar of newly tested engines rolled through the air like thunder. One by one, completed bombers took off from the adjacent runway, a formation of B-24s glinting in the Michigan sunlight, climbing steadily into the cold spring sky. Karl Dietrich shaded his eyes, tracking their ascent. He had watched hundreds of bombers from the ground in Europe, but this was different. Here he saw how easily they were born. The American officer guiding the group lit a cigarette and offered one to the POWs. "You see those?" he said, nodding toward the departing aircraft. "By this time tomorrow, they'll be over Germany." No one spoke. The statement hung in the air like a physical weight. Sergeant Franz Bauer broke the silence first. "You mean, this factory alone sends them?" The officer nodded. "This one and 4 others just like it. Then there's Seattle, Fort Worth, Tulsa. Hell, Ford makes more aircraft engines than Daimler ever dreamed of. It's a machine that doesn't stop." Carl looked down at the cigarette between his fingers. Rough, American-made, harsh but steady burning. He thought of the men still fighting back home, the exhausted ground crews, the airmen flying patched-up Messerschmitts, the women melting down pots and pans for scrap aluminum. He remembered his old factory outside Leipzig, half destroyed by bombing, its workers scavenging for copper, wire and steel rivets, and here, thousands of miles away, is a country untouched by war, built fleets faster than the Reich could repair a single runway. He tried to imagine Germany matching this. Even if every factory ran day and night, even if every worker gave everything, the math didn't work. The Americans didn't just build, they mass-produced destruction on an industrial scale. A low rumble shook the ground as another B-17 roared overhead, its belly gleaming like a silver hammer in the light. The POWs instinctively ducked, then straightened, realizing the irony. They weren't hiding from bombers now. They were standing beneath the hands that made them. The officer gestured for the group to follow. "Come on," he said. "You'll want to see this next part." They entered a smaller annex adjacent to the main factory. Inside, a vast map of the United States stretched across an entire wall. Red lines traced train routes and supply chains from the East Coast to California. Pins marked production hubs: Detroit for engines, Seattle for airframes, Kansas for assembly, Pittsburgh for steel. The sight was dizzying, a single nation functioning like a living organism, every city a cell, every factory a heartbeat. "This is how we do it," said the officer. "A bomber might start life in Michigan, get its wings in California, engines from Ohio, radios from Chicago. Everything fits together because it's all the same pattern. Same size, same parts, same precision." Carl stepped closer to the map, his eyes scanning the glowing network. He had heard the propaganda about American abundance, but it always sounded like myth, until now. He realized that while Germany had perfected engineering, America had perfected production. He murmured quietly, almost to himself, "You could fight forever with this." The officer heard him. "That's the idea." Outside, the shift whistle blew. Dozens of workers streamed from the plant doors. Men, women, even teenagers, all laughing, covered in grease, holding lunch pails. Trucks rolled in with new materials. No sirens, no fear, no bombers overhead. Just industry in motion. Carl thought of the factories back in Bremen, their roofs torn open by Allied raids, the workers digging bodies from rubble before restarting the machines. He remembered the shortages, the endless waiting for parts, the improvisation, and he knew, with a hollow certainty, that Germany could never match this rhythm. The truth settled over him like cold rain. The war was already lost, not on the battlefield, but on the assembly line. That night, back in the POW camp, Carl sat in his bunk with a stub of pencil and a scrap of paper. He began to write a letter he knew would never be sent. "We thought courage alone would win, but they build courage by the thousands, and everyone has wings." He folded the paper and tucked it into his boot, unsure why. perhaps to remind himself that he had seen the real weapon of this war, not bombs or tanks, but the unstoppable hum of a factory. April 7th, 1944, 2 days later. Somewhere in the American Midwest, a train clattered across the plains carrying the same group of German prisoners, back toward their camp. The landscape outside was endless. Fields, factories, smokestacks, power lines stretching to the horizon. Karl Dietrich sat by the window, hands cuffed loosely in front of him, watching the country roll past like an unbroken machine. Every few miles, another industrial complex appeared. Steel mills, shipyards, machine works, each one alive with light and motion. Freight cars moved in long, synchronized columns loaded with crates marked Lockheed, Boeing, Curtiss-Wright. Karl couldn't help but count them. Dozens, then hundreds, and all feeding the same colossal effort. Franz Bauer leaned closer, his voice barely audible over the rattle of the train. "Do you think they'll ever stop?" Karl shook his head slowly. "No, that's the point. They don't have to stop." In Germany, every bomb that fell demanded weeks of repair, every air raid crippled production. Here industry was endless, untouched by war. He had once believed the Luftwaffe's might was unstoppable. The precision of its aircraft, the discipline of its engineers, the bravery of its pilots. But now he understood the real weapon wasn't perfection. It was volume. He remembered the B-24 Witchcraft rolling out of the Willow Run hangar, sunlight gleaming off its silver fuselage. The workers cheering. The foreman shouting, "Another one done, next!" The speed, the ease, the sheer confidence. It had terrified him more than any Allied bombing raid. That evening, after the train returned to the camp, the German POWs were herded back into their barracks. The guards, tired but casual, offered them coffee. The air smelled faintly of diesel and smoke from nearby train yards. Karl sat by the small window, staring at the distant glow of an American city. Even from miles away, he could see the lights of factories still burning against the night, the rhythm of a nation that never slept. Franz sat across from him, arms folded. "You know," he muttered, "back home we used to say German hands build the finest machines in the world." Karl looked up slowly. "They still do," he said quietly. "But it doesn't matter how fine if they can't build enough of them." There was silence. Then almost wistfully, Karl added, "We thought war was fought by soldiers, but it's fought by workers, by machines, by people we never see." The next morning, during roll call, one of the American guards, a young man barely 20, handed Karl a newspaper. The headline read, "Yankee factories break new record. One bomber every hour." Karl traced the words with his finger. One every hour, 24 bombers a day, 700 a month. He thought of the Luftwaffe bases he'd worked on, the shortages, the delays, the desperate improvisation to keep aging aircraft in the air. He thought of the young German pilots who would face these machines wave after wave, until the sky itself belonged to America. And for the first time, Karl Dietrich felt the full truth, not as a prisoner, but as a man who understood the scale of what he had witnessed. The United States had turned its factories into a war machine so vast, so relentless that no strategy or bravery could overcome it. Later, as he lay in his bunk, the sound of the camp generators hummed faintly through the cold night. It reminded him of the factory floor, that steady mechanical heartbeat. He closed his eyes and whispered, half to himself, "They build as if the war were already won." Outside, the searchlights swept across the wire fence. Beyond it, far in the distance, another train passed, a long, heavy line of boxcars filled with engines, wings, and dreams forged from steel. And Karl knew that every mile of track, every rivet, every spark from an American welder's torch was another step toward the end of the Reich. The war, he realized, would not be decided by generals, but by workers who built bombers like automobiles.